All right, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling the fall of the Qin Dynasty.
Ooh, an empire that went down in a blaze of glory, right? Or maybe not so glorious.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. They unified China, built this massive empire, and then boom, gone in a flash.
Yeah, a historical blink and you miss it kind of thing.
So, to try and understand this whole mess, we're going to be looking at some excerpts from an analysis of the Zizi Tongjin.
That massive Chinese historical text.
Exactly, specifically focusing on Qin Emperor Huhai, the guy who took over after the legendary Qin Shi Huang.
Right, right.
And our deep dive mission here is to figure out why his reign was so short.
It's a juicy question, isn't it? Why did this seemingly invincible empire just crumble under him? What went wrong?
Well, to get to the bottom of that, we're going to do something kind of different.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Instead of just listing all of Huhai's mistakes, we're going to look at what he inherited from dear old dad.
Interesting approach. So, examining the legacy of Qin Shi Huang to understand the context Huhai stepped into.
I like it. Did these supposed advantages actually have some hidden, dangers lurking beneath the surface?
Ah, so that's the angle.
Hmm?
Was Huhai even set up for success, or was the Qin dynasty, destined to implode from the get-go?
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. What was the first thing Huhai inherited? What was at the very foundation of his reign?
Well, he inherited a lot, but first and foremost, a vast territory. I mean, we're talking most of the known world at the time.
Wow, so he's basically handed the keys to a superpower, right?
Yeah, the Qin had just stomped out all their major rivals, and bam, unified empire.
That must have felt pretty sweet, at least at first.
Sure, on the surface, it's like every ruler's dream. But let's be real, managing an empire that size, that's got to come with its own unique set of headaches.
Oh, absolutely. I can already imagine the logistical nightmares.
Right, and we're not just talking about the size, but the diversity too. Think about it, all those different cultures, customs, expectations.
Yeah, how do you even begin to keep everyone happy? Or at least not actively rebelling?
Exactly. The Qin had this huge challenge, how to integrate all these groups, make them feel like they're part of something, ensure their loyalty.
I see where you're going with this. Sounds like a recipe for trouble if
Yeah.
you don't handle it just right. So, was the way they governed up to the task? What was that second crucial inheritance?
Well, they had this super centralized system of governance.
Centralized. So, like all the power flowing from one point?
Pretty much. It was Qin Shi Huang's big innovation, and it did give them amazing control over resources and manpower.
So, theoretically, Huhai could just snap his fingers and legions would march from one end of the empire to the other.
In theory, yeah. Think about it. Instant troop movements, resource allocation, boom, boom, boom. Efficiency through the roof.
It's like a well-oiled, ancient bureaucratic machine.
Exactly. But, and there's always a but, right? The centralization made them kind of vulnerable, too.
Vulnerable? How so? It seems like they had it all figured out.
Well, imagine what happens if the central authority, the emperor or his top advisors, if they make a mistake. Or worse, if there's some kind of internal conflict.
Ooh, I see. The whole system could just go kaput, right?
Exactly. One weak link at the top, and the whole chain falls apart. Plus, let's not forget about all those diverse groups we talked about.
Right. Maybe not everyone was thrilled about being micromanaged from some distant capital.
You got it. So this inheritance, while powerful, was also a bit of a gamble.
Yeah, starting to see how these advantages had a dark side too.
Two sides to every coin, right? So, speaking of inheritance, what do you think Huhai got in terms of, let's say, guiding principles? What was the philosophy he was handed?
Oh, you mean the whole, the way they thought about ruling, their ideology?
Exactly. That's the third big thing Huhai inherited. The legalist concept of governing.
Okay, legalism. Refresh my memory. What was the gist of that again?
It's all about order and control, my friend. Think clear laws, strict punishments, rewards for obedience. No room for wishy-washy stuff.
So a very, structured, law-based approach. And how did that play out in practice, especially given, the scale and diversity of the Qin Empire?
Oh, a mixed bag, to be honest. See, legalism really emphasized obedience, but not necessarily understanding.
Obedience without understanding, isn't that kind of, asking for trouble?
It certainly created some tension, especially for those folks who are used to a different way of doing things. And there's this fascinating text, the Wudu chapter in the Han Feixi, a key legalist work.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. What does it say?
It actually argues that you should ditch traditional wisdom and just rely on the law, like the law is the ultimate authority.
Wow, that's a pretty hardcore stance. So no room for interpretation, no consideration for local customs, just here's the law, obey or else.
Pretty much. And you can see how that might rub some people the wrong way, especially those who are newly conquered and not used to this system.
Yeah, talk about culture clash. It's starting to feel like this whole legalist approach was more about control than, actually governing effectively.
It definitely prioritized control, that's for sure. And this is where things get really interesting when you compare it to, say, someone like Plato.
Plato, the Greek philosopher. What does he have to do with ancient China?
Well, Plato had some pretty insightful ideas about law, too. He talked about how there are two kinds of laws. Laws for slaves, which are just straight up commands.
Do this, don't do that kind of thing.
Exactly. And then there are laws for citizens, which actually include reasons and justifications.
So it's not just about blind obedience, but about understanding the why behind the law.
You got it. Plato believed that if people understood the reasoning, they'd be more likely to obey and would create a more just and harmonious society.
It's like instead of just fearing punishment, you actually buy into the system.
Right. You feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
That makes a lot of sense. So where does the Qin dynasty fit into all this? Were they team slave law or team citizen law?
Well, let's just say their system looked a lot more like those laws for slaves than Plato's ideal.
Oof, that's not a good sign. So they're demanding obedience without explanation, trying to govern a massive, diverse empire, and all on the foundation of legalism.
Yeah, the warning lights are starting to flash, aren't they?
Big time. It's like they're juggling chainsaws while blindfolded.
Maybe not the best approach to empire management.
Definitely not. So we've got this vast territory, the centralized system, and now this legalist concept. What else did Huhai inherit that might have contributed to, the whole empire going kaboom?
Well, think about the actual machinery of government. He inherited a really, really developed bureaucratic institution.
Matt, the people who actually make the wheels turn, the ones pushing the paperwork.
Exactly. This is a whole network of officials, from the bigwigs at the top to the local magistrates, all working to make sure the emperor's will was carried out.
Sounds like a well-oiled machine, at least on paper.
It was designed to be super efficient, but was it too efficient? That's the question. Like, imagine trying to govern this giant, diverse empire with just a set of predefined rules.
Ooh, I see. No room for flexibility, no adapting to local circumstances. Just here's the rule book, apply it everywhere, no exceptions.
You got it. And that created some major problems down the line.
Yeah, because governing people isn't like baking a cake, right? You can't just follow a recipe and expect the same result every time.
Exactly. Human societies are messy, they're complex. You got to be able to adjust, to improvise.
So it sounds like this bureaucratic inheritance, while impressive, also had some, let's say, limitations.
For sure. It was great for enforcing uniformity, but not so great for dealing with, the messiness of real life.
Okay, so we've covered the territory, the government structure, the philosophy, what's left. Did Huhai inherit anything else that might have, added fuel to the fire?
Well, there's one more thing. It's a little more personal. He inherited a family.
Oh, right, the joys of family. I bet those family reunions were a blast.
Especially considering it was an imperial family. I mean, talk about high stakes.
Yeah, I bet those sibling rivalries were a bit more intense than your average family squabble.
A bit. And remember, this was a time when succession to the throne wasn't always clear-cut. So having a bunch of brothers and sisters could be a real liability.
A liability. So how did Huhai deal with this, let's call it, delicate situation?
He did what any ambitious, power-hungry emperor would do. He streamlined things, shall we say.
Streamlined, you mean?
Yep, he had most of his siblings executed.
Whoa, talk about cutting down on the Christmas card list.
Right. He was taking no chances. It shows he was decisive, ruthless even, but definitely not afraid to consolidate power.
That's one way to handle family drama. So, to recap, we've got a vast territory, a centralized system, a legalist concept, a massive bureaucracy, and a family that got a whole lot smaller.
It's quite the inheritance, isn't it? Some good, some bad, some downright dangerous. And the question is, did Huhai understand what he was really getting into?
Yeah, did he see the potential pitfalls, the hidden dangers lurking within these gifts?
That's what we're going to unpack in part 2 of this deep dive. So buckle up, because things are about to get really interesting.
Oh, I can't wait. This is shaping up to be a real historical thriller.
Trust me, you won't want to miss it. So we've laid out Huhai's inheritance, and let me tell you, it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, some of those gifts seem more like ticking time bombs, honestly.
Right, like impressive on the surface, but underneath, whoa, trouble brewing.
You've mentioned scale a few times now.
Yeah, scale is key here. It's not just the individual elements, but how they all play out on this, massive stage. The sheer size of the Qin Dynasty magnified everything.
Okay, so help me understand that. How did the scale make things worse?
Well, think about the legalists. Brilliant guys, right? But they were used to dealing with, smaller states, individual kingdoms.
They didn't have that empire-level experience.
Exactly. They were missing that Zhou dynasty perspective. Yeah.
Okay, back up a sec. What's the Zhou dynasty perspective? Who were they?
The Zhou dynasty ruled for centuries before the Qin, and they were masters of, let's call it, cultural integration.
So they knew how to handle a diverse empire.
Yeah. Unifying a huge territory wasn't just about military might. It was about bringing different cultures together gradually, making them feel like they were all part of something bigger.
So they took their time, didn't just force everyone into a single mold.
Exactly. They understood that people need to adapt, traditions need to blend. It's a process.
And the Qin dynasty just skipped that whole process, right? Too busy conquering to think about the long game.
Bingo. They gobbled up those rival states so fast, it's like they had a bad case of indigestion. No time to, properly digest and integrate all those different cultures and peoples.
And I'm guessing that didn't sit well with the conquered folks.
Not at all. It bred resentment, fueled rebellion. It's like shaking up a bottle of soda and then popping the top explosion city.
And their whole legal system, that obey or else mentality, probably didn't help smooth things over, did it?
Oh, absolutely not. That rigid legalism, with its focus on punishment over understanding, it dehumanized people. Imagine being told what to do constantly, but never the why.
Yeah, it'd make you feel like a cog in a machine, not a valued member of society.
Exactly. It creates this climate of fear, suspicion, and that's not exactly a recipe for a happy, stable empire. And again, scale plays a role here.
Okay, how so?
Well, on a smaller scale, where everyone kind of knows the rules and the reasons behind them, legalism might work, you know,
Yeah.
but stretch it across this huge, diverse empire, and it's a disaster waiting to happen.
It's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole, right? The
Yeah.
system just doesn't fit the reality.
Perfect metaphor. So we've got the rapid expansion, the rigid laws, and then there's the whole bureaucratic system, remember?
Oh, yeah, that super efficient, but maybe too efficient machine we talked about.
The prefecture county system,
Yeah.
standardized, uniform, applied everywhere without much regard for local customs or traditions.
It's like they were trying to make everyone wear the same uniform regardless of their size or shape.
Right. And that just breeds resistance. People want to be treated as individuals. They value their unique cultures and ways of life.
Reminds me of that Greek myth about Procrustes, the innkeeper who made all his guests fit into the same bed, even if it meant touching them or chopping off their limbs.
Wow, that's dark, but a brilliant analogy. The Qin Dynasty was kind of like Procrustes, trying to force everyone into their rigid system no matter the cost.
So even before Huhai takes the throne, we've got this empire teetering on the brink, right? Internal tensions, simmering resentment, a system that's more about control than genuine unity.
Yeah, the seeds of discontent were already sown. Now, could Huhai have changed course? Maybe. But he and his advisors were sailing in uncharted waters.
Mm.
They didn't have our benefit of hindsight. They couldn't see the big picture, the historical patterns. They lacked that perspective to really understand the potential consequences of their actions.
They didn't have a map, so they kept driving straight ahead, even though the road was crumbling beneath them.
Exactly. And, ironically, their success in unifying China might have blinded them to these weaknesses. Well, they just achieved this incredible feat, right? They were on top of the world. So it's natural to think, hey, our system works. We're doing something right.
It's like winning a bunch of battles and thinking you're invincible, even though you might be making some strategic blunders along the way.
Right. They were focused on the short-term gains, the immediate victories, and maybe didn't see those long-term cracks forming in the foundation.
It's a classic case of, like, winning the battle but losing the war.
Exactly. Now, before we get to the actual collapse, let's zoom in on Huhai himself. We know he inherited this complex situation, but how did he personally navigate it? What kind of leader was he?
Yeah, was he just a puppet? Or was he actively shaping events?
Well, remember how he dealt with his siblings. That was a pretty bold move, eliminating potential rivals right off the bat.
Yeah, talk about a power move. Decisive, but also, kind of ruthless.
Exactly. It shows he was a man of action, not afraid to make tough choices.
Hmm.
But whether those are the right choices, well, that's a whole other debate.
So was he a tyrant who accelerated the Qin dynasty's demise? Or was he more of a tragic figure, caught in a system that was already spinning out of control?
It's probably a bit of both, honestly. He was a product of his time, shaped by the legalist philosophy, but he also made decisions that had real consequences, both good and bad.
So a complex figure, operating in a complex situation. And speaking of complexity, let's go back to the legal system for a moment. You drew that fascinating comparison between Qin legalism and Plato's ideas about law.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast, isn't it? On one hand, you have the Qin with their laws for slaves, demanding obedience without explanation.
And on the other hand, you have Plato advocating for laws for citizens, where understanding and reason are key.
Right. Plato believed that a just society needs citizens who buy into the system, who understand why the laws are there, who see them as a reflection of shared values, not just tools for control.
So it's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility, not just blind obedience.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where people are motivated to do the right thing because they understand why it's right, not just because they fear punishment.
That makes a lot of sense. So how did this difference in philosophy play out in practice? How did the Qin dynasty's legal system actually impact the lives of everyday people?
Well, imagine living in a society where the rules are constantly changing, where you're never quite sure what's allowed and what's forbidden, and where even a minor infraction could have serious consequences for you and your family.
Yeah, that sounds pretty stressful, like walking on eggshells all the time.
Exactly. And that's the kind of environment the Qin legal system created. It was a system designed to control and suppress, not to nurture or empower.
So instead of fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose, it created a climate of fear and resentment.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the issue of scale. What might have worked on a smaller scale, where people had a better understanding of the laws and the reasoning behind them, became a major problem when applied to a vast, diverse empire.
So the Qin dynasty's legal system, combined with its rigid bureaucratic structure and its rapid expansion, created this perfect storm of factors that ultimately contributed to its downfall.
You got it. They were essentially setting themselves up for failure. It's a classic case of a system that couldn't adapt, couldn't evolve, and ultimately couldn't survive.
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. Sooner or later, it's all going to come crashing down.
A powerful image. And that's exactly what happened to the Qin dynasty. But before we get to the final collapse, let's delve a little deeper into the human cost of this system. What were the tangible consequences of this legalistic approach, this emphasis on control and punishment?
Yeah, how did it actually play out in the lives of everyday people?
Well, one of the most devastating consequences was the system of collective punishment.
Collective punishment, what does that mean?
It means that if someone committed a crime, not only they would be punished, but their entire family, sometimes even their whole community, would suffer the consequences.
Wow, that's incredibly harsh. So one person's actions could bring down punishment on dozens, even hundreds of others.
Exactly. And you can imagine the kind of fear and suspicion this created. People were afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge authority, even if they witnessed injustice.
Because they didn't want to risk bringing harm to their loved ones.
Right. It was a system that bred silence and compliance, even in the face of wrongdoing. And it's a stark reminder of how a legal system, when used as a tool of oppression rather than justice, can have a devastating impact on society as a whole.
So the Qin Dynasty's legal system was effective in suppressing dissent, but at a terrible cost. It created a society where people were constantly looking over their shoulders, afraid to trust even their neighbors.
Exactly. And that kind of atmosphere is not conducive to creativity, innovation, or progress. It's a recipe for stagnation and ultimately decline.
It's like trying to grow a flower in a dark, airless room. It might survive for a while, but it'll never truly thrive.
A perfect analogy. And that's what happened to the Qin Dynasty.
Yeah.
They created a system that was so focused on control, so obsessed with order, that it ultimately choked the life out of its own people.
So we've got this legal system that's creating fear and resentment, a rigid bureaucracy that's stifling innovation, and an empire that's expanding faster than it can integrate its new subjects. It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Absolutely. And all of these factors are about to come to a head in a spectacular and tragic fashion. But that's a story for part 3 of our deep dive.
Oh man, I'm on the edge of my seat. I can't wait to see how this all unfolds. So we've spent this deep dive really digging into what made the Qin Dynasty tick.
And maybe more importantly, what made it ultimately talk its last talk.
Yeah, it's fascinating how something so powerful could implode so quickly.
History's full of these, like, cautionary tales, empires rising and falling. It's a never-ending cycle, isn't it?
But what can we actually learn from all this? I mean, it happened centuries ago in a totally different world. What's the takeaway for us here and now?
Oh, there are tons of takeaways. The Qin Dynasty is like a masterclass in what not to do when you're, building a lasting legacy.
Okay, I'm all yours. Give me the top lessons.
Well, the big one that screams out at me is don't be rigid. Like, seriously, flexibility, adaptability, those are your best friends in any situation.
It's like the bamboo that bends in the wind survives the storm, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Qin Dynasty, they were more like, I don't know, an oak tree in a hurricane.
It's just waiting to get snapped in half.
Yeah, and snap they did. Their legal system, their bureaucracy, their whole approach to governing, it was all about control, uniformity, no room for, like, give and take.
And that worked great when they were conquering, but not so much when it came to actually ruling a vast, diverse empire.
Right. Conquering is one thing, governing is a whole other ballgame.
So it sounds like the lesson here is learn to adapt. Be willing to adjust your course, listen to feedback, be open to new information.
Yep. Because the world's always changing, right? What works today might not work tomorrow.
So, staying stuck in your ways, clinging to the old playbook, that's a recipe for disaster.
For sure. And this applies to everything, not just empires. Think about businesses, organizations, even our own personal lives.
We've all got to learn to roll with the punches, be open to new ways of doing things.
Exactly. Because the alternative is, well, we end up like the Qin Dynasty, a cautionary tale in the history books.
So this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the dangers of rigidity and the importance of adaptability.
And hopefully it sparks some curiosity in you too. There's so much more to explore about the Qin Dynasty. It's a treasure trove of historical insights.
I know I'm definitely going to be hitting the books.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I got to ask, could the Qin Dynasty have been saved? Was there any point where they could have turned things around?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's tough to say for sure, but I think there were definitely missed opportunities.
Like, what if they'd slowed down their expansion, focused more on integrating their new subjects?
Yeah, or if they'd been more willing to listen to dissenting voices, to consider alternative approaches to governing.
Or maybe if they just chilled out a bit on the whole legalism thing.
Possibly. But hindsight's 20/20, right?
Mm.
It's easy for us to see the mistakes they made, but they were operating in a very different context.
But that's the whole point of studying history, isn't it? To learn from the past, to avoid repeating the same mistakes.
Exactly. And the Qin Dynasty offers us a wealth of lessons,
Yeah.
if we're willing to listen. So as you go about your day, think about the Qin, think about those choices they made, and ask yourself, what can I learn from their experience? How can I be more flexible, more adaptable in my own life?
That's a great challenge. I'm definitely going to keep that in mind. And for all of you listening, here's a final thought to chew on. Could the Qin Dynasty have survived if they'd embraced a more flexible approach, or was their rigid system ultimately their downfall? There's no easy answer, but it's something to ponder as you delve deeper into this fascinating period of history. Thanks for joining us on this epic deep dive into the Qin Dynasty. We'll see you next time for another adventure through the annals of history.